Hello, everyone. I'm Ross Anderson, Deputy Editor at The Atlantic. Thank you for joining our event today, where we will reflect on a year of the pandemic and explore what our immediate future holds. It's no secret to all of you watching that the past 12 months have been among the most challenging and heart-wrenching in our lifetimes. We have lost friends and family members, faced financial hardship, and had to make some really drastic changes to our day-to-day life. The American population is fortunately now getting vaccinated, slowly but surely, and there is a promise of return to life as we remember it. But there's still a lot of questions about what the next few months and the next few years will look like. We've received a lot of those questions in advance from our subscribers, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can during the course of this discussion over the next 40 minutes or so. But feel free to add your own questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to some of those too. Now let's introduce our panel. We have three Atlantic staff writers with us today. Derek Thompson, who covers economics and technology, and has also written about hygiene theater during the pandemic and how COVID will affect where and how and when we work. We have Sarah Zhang, who has covered many aspects of the pandemic, but especially the COVID vaccine rollout. And Katie Wu, a new member of the Atlantic's reporting team, who has really had quite a fast start covering the pandemic also for us. Welcome to all three of you. And I want to start by asking each of you a question. We're going to be talking a lot about the present moment and the future. But first, since we've just kind of passed this 1-year anniversary of when this really all intruded in our lives in a big way, I was wondering if each of you could kind of take me through the moment when you first realized, A, that this was going to be a huge story, and B, that it was something that you yourself wanted to cover.
Shall I start?
Yeah, go for it.
Happy to start. Thanks, Ross. And it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming. I remember that just about a year ago, Ross, you and I went out for drinks with one of your friends in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. And I remember a comment that you made when we sat down. First of all, when we cheers with the butt of our glasses, I remember, so as to partially avoid the possibility of cheersing with the part that we were actually sipping from and touching lips to. And that was sort of like a sort of early negotiation of sort of the geometry of how this virus would spread. We didn't know how it would spread. We thought that maybe the most common way that it would spread would be through touch. And so we cheers butts of the glass. And you made a comment then that one of our other colleagues who's done extraordinary work throughout the pandemic, Rob Meyer, that he was really starting to freak out, that he had been following the story really, really closely since the early data coming out of China, and that he was really starting to freak. And that made me nervous because I'm always made nervous when a person who I know is smarter about a subject than I am is freaking out about a subject that I'm not freaking out about. And so that, I think, was the first drop of anxiety in what ended up being obviously an enormous ocean of anxiety to come in the last 12 months.
And Derek, when did you yourself think, you know what, someone who has really written about a lot of things, but has primarily focused on, let's say, economics and technology, when did you decide this is something I really want to take on and start thinking about professionally?
Yeah, my introduction to the subject really was through the lens of economics. The first articles that I wrote about the pandemic dealt with the economic response to the pandemic. One of the first countries to put together a really clear plan for combating this pandemic and making sure that people were that people got through however many months it would last was Denmark. Denmark, for a variety of reasons, they have a sort of tripartite relationship between the government, employers, and workers. They got together over this big weekend that was, I guess, exactly about 364 days ago, that weekend when, the NBA canceled and the world seemed to come to a stop. They all got together in a room. They said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to flash freeze the economy. We're going to put it in a kind of private sector coma, and we're going to pay the private sector while we are keeping it under this sort of administered coma. And that idea that I was writing about, and I talked to the labor minister of Denmark about, really ended up becoming our approach in lots of ways, if not in all ways, right? We created a huge fund of money to help small businesses. We gave people lots of different checks. We upped unemployment insurance. We did as much as we possibly could to essentially spend trillions and trillions, probably up to $4 or $5 trillion, to keep this patient alive while we had to protect it in order to keep the pandemic from spreading through an otherwise normal leisure and hospitality economy. So that was my, I guess, introduction to pandemic coverage.
Katie, what about you? Tell us your meet cute with the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think my answer will be a little different from everyone else's because I was not at the Atlantic at the time. I was actually freelancing, and I actually remember this moment. I was sitting in the Boston office of Undark magazine where I was doing some freelance work at the time. And this was sometime in February. I was reading all of these reports. I'd been following the story about the virus for about a month at that point. And I think I had gone between like, oh, this is fine, it'll be contained within a few weeks, to holy crap, this is spreading a lot faster than I thought it would. And it was kind of around then that I started thinking, like, this could be a big story, not just for science writers, but for everyone. And I really got my start with Smithsonian Magazine, which is where I was freelancing for at the time. And I wrote a bunch of explainer pieces to kind of start things off. But I then moved to the Times. This will be a theme apparently in this conversation, me hopping around all over these places. And that's when I started really diving into a lot of the news of the pandemic.
Sarah, what about you? I have to give a plug for Sarah. I remember when the pandemic struck, was working on a fantastic cover story that she wrote about Down syndrome, which was on our September issue.
December issue, but what is time anymore? It's funny. Thank you for mentioning that. I would also say that I was on the reporting trip for that story when the Wuhan lockdown happened. This was in, I think, mid or late March or mid or late January. I remember before I went, I had a conversation with our science editor, Sarah Laskow, and we were talking about what to cover in 2020. And I mentioned kind of very offhandedly, oh, there's this new virus in China. And we're like, oh yeah, maybe that'd be interesting. And I think both of us at the time thought it might be something, at worst, something like SARS or MERS, where it might be a news story for a while, but it would not reach us. But when I was in Denmark is when the Wuhan lockdown happened. And that was like my first sense of, oh, wow, this is really serious. I also funnily enough, caught a cold on that trip. At the time, I was very convinced it was not COVID, but in retrospect, who knows? But I was very worried because I was going around in airports coughing all the time and like going to the Danish pharmacy and asking, do you have cough medication? I assumed everyone probably thought I had COVID, and maybe who knows what I had at this point. I just remember it, and I think that's sort of what's changed so much over the past year as well. I remember the time as someone who is, who's from China. My family in China was freaking out about it. I think it was very much a virus that was, if you looked Asian, you were suspicious. I think now there's almost no coronavirus in China right now, and it's just amazing how quickly and how much it's flipped.
I want to go to a question from Josiah, who's in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. One framework for thinking about the vaccine rollout that's underway right now, which initially seemed like it was going a bit slowly like the rest of the American pandemic response, but now has accelerated where we're nearing 3 million shots a day, and we're like, pretty high on the country leaderboard when it comes to like percent of population who's vaccinated. But still, we're in this kind of, or one way of thinking about where we are is we're in this race between getting everyone vaccinated before variants of COVID that can sort of escape these vaccines evolve and kind of really get going in the population. And I was wondering, and this really is a question for anybody, but perhaps Sarah and Katie chiefly, how do you handicap like our current speed in that sort of fight?
Yeah, I think early on there were a lot of graphs showing like how slowly we're vaccinating and how it would take like months or years for us to get to herd immunity. I think obviously we've like really accelerated how quickly we're vaccinating. We're at I think millions of people a day now. And I think we're really doing pretty well. I think on the question of the variants, I think it's, you know, it's certainly something to be vigilant about, right? Like there are really two reasons why we might be worried about variants. One is that they might be more transmissible, as in the case of the UK variant. In that case, it might mean that before people get vaccinated, we might still, if we're not careful, end up having another surge. The other is, will they escape immunity? And I think that question is actually maybe not as worrisome. You know, this virus is certainly evolving, but it's not evolving that fast, and we can update our vaccines pretty quickly. And I think one way to think about these vaccines is that they aren't necessarily like a protective spell that are going to give you perfect immunity or no immunity at all. What they do is that they're going to make you less sick than if you did not have the vaccine at all. So at the end of the day, like these vaccines, they all protect in some way against all of the variants. And so I think it's something that vaccine makers should really watch, especially in the long term. But I would not be too worried about them right now. The flu, for example, evolves much more quickly than coronavirus, and we're able to keep up with the flu shot every year.
Yeah, I think Sarah pretty much covered it. I guess a couple really small things that I'll add to that is, I know it's very tempting to frame the variants as, you know, these new versions of the virus that can fully escape a vaccine, but it's totally not the case. It's not like we are having a tiger turn into an armadillo. It's like a tiger, you know, changing its stripes slightly. And in a lot of cases, these variants are still really, really recognizable. Like the preliminary studies that are coming out about how effective these vaccines are probably going to be against the variants, they actually look pretty good. There's a reduction in how effective they are, but it's not a complete disappearance. It's not like these variants are punching through the barriers that these vaccines are putting up in front of people. And I think the really wonderful thing about vaccination is, you know, if there is more protection out there, the more people that are vaccinated, the fewer people are going to be infected, the fewer people are going to be carrying the virus for long periods of time, and the fewer opportunities the virus is going to have to mutate. So we're really fighting the variants on multiple fronts here by really keeping pace with vaccinations, which I think we are doing pretty well, as Sarah just said.
Sticking with the vaccines for a moment, I was wondering, I recently, this is a riff on a question from Jeffrey in Ann Arbor. I recently pre-registered for my vaccine here in DC, and I got to the end and there was a little drop-down menu that said, you know, do you have a preference among the Johnson & Johnson, the Pfizer, and the Moderna? And I really wished that I could like patch in a three-way call with Sarah and Katie so they could tell me about which one I should choose. Could you kind of like run through the sort of pros and cons of each of those?
Ross, did you choose one?
I didn't. I said.
Yeah, I'm happy to start this one off, though I do want to plug Sarah's piece. I think it was called "What's the Use of a Pretty Good Vaccine" that came out a few weeks ago that really laid this out nicely. It's pretty cool that you had the option. A lot of people don't get to choose, but I don't think that really changes much. The best vaccine to get is the one that is available to you first, in my opinion. And for people who don't have the choice, they should not feel like they have been cheated out of an opportunity to select something. Really, you know, looking at the efficacy numbers, which have been really, really highly publicized. It's about 95% efficacy for Moderna and Pfizer's vaccines, and, you know, something closer in the 70% range for Johnson & Johnson, depending on the country that they were looking in. Those are really hard to compare. We know that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine trials were run earlier than the Johnson & Johnson ones. And that was, you know, importantly, before some of these variants were kind of running roughshod over some of the countries that these vaccines were trialed in. It's really hard to compare. You know, it's like comparing how good your umbrella is when there's a light drizzle out versus when there's this massive maelstrom and the wind is pelting you with hail and all these kinds of things. When the weather changes, certain pieces of equipment are going to be a little less effective. So I try and caution against people saying like, oh, this vaccine is going to be 20% less effective than this other one. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is great. A huge benefit of it is it's easy to store, easy to ship, and you only need one shot. You get the shot, you wait 2 weeks, and you are considered fully vaccinated. When you get your first shot of Moderna or Pfizer, you either have to wait 5 weeks or 6 weeks until you can reach that status. And that can be a huge win for some people, especially if you're in an area where it's really hard to go back to your vaccination site, or you just don't have good access to the resources that remind you and get you back to that point. Those are some of the things that I consider. I'm sure Sarah can add a lot more.
Yeah, no, I think that really covers it really well. I think maybe one way of thinking about it, I would add is that there's a lot of individual variation in how people respond to vaccines, right? Like we're looking at these efficacy numbers, they're population numbers. But everybody's immune system is a little different. Your like history of exposure to your immune system is a little bit different. If you just look at even in one trial, like everyone who got a Pfizer vaccine, some people got, a high fever and they were kind of laid out for a day. Some people felt nothing at all. There's going to be a lot of just individual variation. At a certain point, they're kind of like diminishing returns and trying to game out what a subtle difference this vaccine might mean for you, because there's just going to be a little variation.
Derek, I want to go to you on a subject that you've written really at length about several times, and have changed my thinking actually every time I've encountered your work on cities, in particular like cities as affected by the pandemic. Paul from New York asks how you think big cities will fare after the pandemic subsides, which is a huge question. And I'm going to narrow it slightly. I have a friend who works in sort of strategy in a commercial real estate firm. And he said that the people they're talking to say something like, never bet against New York, but, our people are kind of looking at like a 10-year recovery, not a sort of 2 to 5 year recovery. Do you think he's right?
Yeah, I think it's a good way to think about it. I'm of two minds on this point. And honestly, I feel like my work on the subject of the pandemic and cities often flips between the two minds. Like 1 month, I'll write an optimistic take and then a pessimistic take. And then I'll be like, ooh, no, I want to correct an optimistic aspect of that pessimistic take. And I just go back and forth. So if readers are confused about my prediction about the future of American cities, that's because they're reading me closely. I am a little bit confused myself. So let me give you two predictions and then sort of tell you where I am on those now. One sort of qualified optimistic take is that what we're seeing is something akin to a forest fire. With a forest fire, you have the forest that pre-exists the fire, you have the fire that destroys the forest, and then after the fire, in the ashes, you tend to have growth that is more biodiverse than the forest that pre-existed the fire. And in many ways, I think that this could be a picture of what we see in cities like New York. So let's look at what happened in New York. Over the last 10 to 20 years, we saw real estate prices go absolutely bonkers in Manhattan, in Brooklyn. That was true for residential real estate, true for commercial real estate. New York just got unbelievably expensive. We definitely know that New York, especially in terms of its commercial real estate and its rents, has gotten a lot less expensive. Maybe not in terms of home buying for various reasons that I won't get into, but rents and commercial real estate have gotten a lot less expensive. And what that does, I think, is it brings down the cost of New York such that the next generation of people who move into the city can be, more middle class, more immigrants can afford the city than they could maybe, 12 months ago. And that can be really good for entrepreneurship, for the ethnic diversity of the city, for the culinary diversity of the city. And so I think that this sort of forest fire effect could have like an optimistic aspect. The pessimistic version is that there is a longer hangover effect. And I think that hangover effect would be caused by the fact that there's a certain class of, say, white collar worker that has learned from this pandemic that the office is just not nearly as essential as they thought it was 12 or 13 months ago. Like the best line that I got from an economist writing about the future of cities in the pandemic was an economist named David Autor, who said the most important lesson of this pandemic is not that it taught you how to Zoom, it's that it taught everyone around you how to Zoom. So whereas a year ago, if you wanted to say cancel that, lunch meeting with your boss or not come into the office, it was kind of awkward to have to explain to people that you would have to like take it to Zoom. But now none of us will ever be able to forget the experience that we just had. For 12 months, we learned how to do this. And it doesn't mean that like live conferences are over or the office is over or that like, live person-to-person meetings are over. It's not that at all. But if all of that kind of declines by 10%, just that 10% decline could have a huge impact on the future of cities. Like 10% is a bigger number than you think in terms of a wedge that changes a whole industry. In 2019, only 13% of all retail was e-commerce. But every conversation about the future of retail was all about Amazon and e-commerce. And similarly, I think that in 2021, let's say, it's possible, yes, that only 12% of the white collar workforce could be work from home or remote. But just as online retail was the tail that wagged the dog of retail, distributed work, remote work, working from home could be the tail that wags the dog of the white collar workforce. And so it could have huge implications for where people are moving, how they're working, and as your friend, I guess, is looking at what the value of commercial real estate is in places like Washington, D.C. and New York.
Sticking with this theme about sort of social and cultural and logistical changes that we've made to sort of day-to-day life during the pandemic that might stick. How do you think like restaurant dining, travel, concerts, sports, like these sorts of things, are there going to be permanent changes, or are we just going to like snap back to like our pre-pandemic world when this is over or nearly over?
Yeah, I have to say, I can't wait to travel again. And I also can't wait to eat in restaurants again. I really, really want to get back to the sort of leisure aspect of my pre-pandemic life. And I do think that like, to the extent that anyone predicting trends should have like a first principle, that first principle should be that like convenience drives human behavior very efficiently. Like we are very likely to do that which is most fun and most convenient. And I could see that pointing in two directions here. On the one hand, for travel, I see no reason why once the world is vaccinated, and that's a huge asterisk that we might get into later, but once other countries are vaccinated and you have a lot of vaccinations in the US, I see no reason why travel won't snap all the way back. The personal savings rate in this country is its highest in 60 years. People have money that they can spend overall, and they're going to spend it on travel when they can travel again. I really have no doubt about that. When it comes to restaurants, though, I love the indoor restaurant experience, and the indoor restaurant experience is, of course, going to come back. Predicting otherwise would be crazy. But in 2019, I wrote a story talking to some people who were interested in the future of restaurants that came away with these conversations with a prediction. And the prediction was that in 2020, you'd have the first year in the history of restaurants when off-premise spending would be higher than on-premise spending, because the delivery economy was growing so quickly that the future of restaurants was actually going to be more about what we took away from restaurants than ate inside of restaurants. Now that prediction, obviously, for reasons I couldn't have possibly anticipated, was clearly true in 2020. But the fact that people were telling me that suggests that for the convenience reason, takeaway and delivery and restaurant serving, not just as a sit-down experience, but as a delivery experience, even as a kind of grocer for some people, like, selling the ingredients they can use to cook at home or selling the wine they can use to pour with those ingredients. That sort of multifarious aspect of restaurants, I think, is the future of the restaurant industry. And I feel more confident about it because you could have seen it before the pandemic accelerated restaurants even further into that future.
Sarah and Katie, I want to go back to vaccination for a bit. We've been talking, sort of congratulating ourselves and our country for getting up to almost 3 million shots a day. And it strikes me that we're kind of burning quickly through all the people who really want to get a vaccine, of which there obviously are many tens of millions. But soon, or in some number of months, we're going to kind of hit the edge of that group. And we're going to enter, it's going to be mostly people who kind of aren't sure or maybe don't want the vaccine at all. And I'm wondering, since the pandemic struck a year ago in earnest, we've all known that sort of the vaccine was our ticket out of this. And so this issue is sort of, everyone's been kind of preparing for there to be a big kind of anti-vax push against the COVID vaccines. And I just wanted to ask you how you've seen that change. Do you think the Biden administration is doing a good job in its public health comms and kind of trying to bring people who are vaccine skeptical over? What else could be done? Like, what's your read on that subject?
Yeah, I think you saw the anti-vaccine push start before there was even a vaccine, right? Like you started seeing conspiracy theories and the pandemic going around. I think Derek has written really well about how vaccine hesitancy is not really one thing. It can be a lot of different things. On some level, the hesitancy is actually just not wanting to go out of your way to get a vaccine, right? Like right now, getting a vaccine is pretty difficult, right? You have to sign up on a website, you have to do it ahead of time, you might have to go pretty far, you might have to drive there. If you don't have a car, that might be an issue. And if you don't have access to a smartphone or a computer or don't speak English, these are all barriers that even if you want to get a vaccine, just make it really hard to get a vaccine. I think there's probably a pretty large group of people who are open to get a vaccine, but don't want to go out of their way to do it. And so we're seeing in places like New York City now is that people are going door to door and not just vaccinating like one person, but maybe vaccinating everyone in the household. And I think you'll probably need a lot more of that, where you're actually going to exactly where people already are, maybe their workplaces, maybe their homes, directly into neighborhoods, rather than asking people to come to you, like going to where people are rather than asking people to come to the vaccine. I think another big change over time is that the rates of acceptance or willingness to get a vaccine really have gone up over the past few months. A lot of it was, I think, just, it was uncertain, right? There was no vaccine yet. People were polling people, will you get a vaccine when there was no vaccine yet? I think it's pretty understandable why you might say no or not sure. And I think there was also, a fair amount of concern, at least maybe for more liberals than before October, that the vaccine would be some sort of October surprise, and that ended up not being the case. The FDA did hold the line on vaccine approvals and authorizations. So I think some of it is also just, I don't want to be the first one to get the vaccine. And now people are seeing, their friends, their family members, their doctors getting vaccinated. They're no longer the first one. So I think we will pretty rapidly hit the vaccine hesitant, where people are vaccine hesitant, but it's also not a static number. That's going to continue to change. I think the hardest group will be people who really are kind of stridently anti-vax or have already made up their minds and have said that they're never going to get a vaccine. And it's possible that we don't necessarily need to convince them, right? The vaccine, the more people get vaccinated, no matter how many it is, the more the better. I think we should focus on the people who are unsure or hesitant or maybe have questions but can be convinced, rather than spend most of our time trying to think about convincing people who really have already made up their minds.
Yeah, Sarah, I think you put that really well. I don't have much to add, but I think, to sort of really reiterate one of the points that you made, I talked to someone a few weeks ago about, this focus on what she called the movable middle, really distinguishing the people who are staunchly anti-vaccine and the people who are hesitant or skeptical for really understandable reasons. And I have really heard a lot of the wait and see refrain from people, I think, especially while the rollout has been so chaotic. So it's really a question when we kind of will hit that inflection point where supply really, really clearly starts to exceed demand. I think it'll be really different depending on the community that we're looking at. It's going to be really different depending on maybe even the individual vaccines we're looking at. And, it's worth keeping in mind that I don't think we're going to reach a point where we just have millions and millions of vaccines going bad on refrigerator shelves. And if we do reach that point, there are clear things that we can do with those vaccines. There are going to be people all across the world who need those vaccines, who want those vaccines and wouldn't otherwise have access to them. So there are things that, we can do to still benefit the world on a population level scale, even if we're not hitting every single person here in the United States. That's certainly not the only end game.
One lever that I suspect will move some of the merely vaccine hesitant is just ability to travel. A lot of people are like Derek says he is, and certainly I am. Just can't wait to get out back into the broader world when this is over. And I'm just wondering, do we think there will be vaccine passports? Are there countries who are saying that already that they're going to require them? How's that looking?
Yeah, that has already been brought up in multiple places. I mean, Israel is kind of running a little microcosm of this universe, and it's going interestingly. They have opened up some sort of like luxury businesses with the idea that you can sort of show your green pass and say, I am vaccinated. I have clearance to socialize with people. I think it's a really complicated question. And like you said, one big plus of this is it can create an incentive system for people to get the vaccine. Like if people aren't necessarily in the vaccine for the whole idea of immunity, which is important in and of itself, but if they're not in it for that, maybe they're in it for the perks. Maybe it's just to get the status to clear them to go into a restaurant or a movie theater. And that could be powerful. At the same time, I think it's very tricky to roll something like that out at a time when we are still in a demand exceeds supply scenario in many parts of the world. Like we can't just take the average and say that, there are lots of vaccines available. So clearly that must mean like access means everyone who wants a vaccine has access to one. There are going to be pockets of the community that remain I think disadvantaged in terms of their access to vaccines. And anytime that you have a system like that in place and not everybody who needs a vaccine can get one, it's going to create a world of haves and have-nots and exacerbate a lot of the inequities that the pandemic has already kind of laid bare. And that's something that I am really, really, really nervous about, especially because I think the hesitancy in some of these communities that might make it tougher, that's not just something that sprung up. It's because of like these sort of systemic inequities that have already previously disadvantaged these people. And if we sort of make vaccination into a really perk driven system, I feel like that's going to make a lot of things a lot worse. So I don't think we can have a system like that in place until we address access and accessibility first.
Let's stick with that for a second. How unequal internationally is the distribution of vaccines? Like, do we expect that there are countries that will still not be all or mostly vaccinated by 2023, 2024?
I think a really good question is, what is the demand for vaccines in countries that haven't been hit hard by COVID, right? I think all of us in the US have our lives really upended. But if you go to Taiwan, if you go to Korea, if you go to China, people are going about their lives really normally. It could be almost a strange case where the countries that have contained COVID really well have a hard problem in getting people to get vaccinated. I think there'll be a lot of kind of interesting interplays as countries do start opening up, and how they deal with open borders and travelers, and as we were talking about the vaccine passports. I think it is actually somewhat of an open question of how much people in countries that haven't been affected by COVID really want the vaccine.
Derek, if you I know that a theme in your work over the course of the pandemic, and another thing that you've been wrestling with in quite an Atlantic-y and Derek-y sort of back and forth way, is just like comparative studies on who has sort of handled the pandemic the best at the policy level to tamp it down and keep the economy afloat, et cetera, et cetera. And now that we have another few months sort of retrospect to really kind of Monday morning quarterback this thing. If you had to do it all over again, it's March 2020. What country's playbook do you want to run?
Oh, wow. That is a hard question. The difficulty of Monday morning quarterbacking the pandemic is the pandemic isn't like 1 week of football. It's the full season. And so you can't Monday morning quarterback on the Monday after week 3 what the results are going to be the Monday after week 17. So, in the first few months of this year, of last year, what are years? It was really easy to say that, Europe, for example, was doing a better job than the US, that their policies were working better than the US. But look right now at vaccines per capita. Europe is a basket case, and we are lapping them, especially in terms of the continental EU. The UK and the US are doing way, way better than the EU in terms of vaccine rollout. So, all right, that's a week one sort of prediction that was overturned by week 17. Then you look at a state like Florida. Florida has just been all over the place when it comes to sort of a narrativizing standpoint. Early on in the pandemic, Ron DeSantis looked like a genius. He wasn't shutting down Florida. He wasn't doing mask mandates, and Florida did not have a huge wave in the spring. But then in the late spring, early summer, Florida was one of the worst hit places, at least statistically speaking, in the world in terms of the density of COVID cases per capita. And then now I'm just writing, in fact, about sort of the Florida Rashomon, how many different narratives are competing over what the story in Florida is. You have conservatives saying that Florida clearly shows that an open economy is the best, and liberals who warned that Florida was going to lead the country in deaths per capita. It's now at 27th. So it's basically median, right? It actually violates both the strong conservative and strong liberal opinion. But I'm filibustering because you asked me to name a single country that I would choose. Strategically filibustering, I should say, because I couldn't think of the right answer at first. I think overall, it's really hard to argue that, say, among large democracies, South Korea and Japan, it's hard to say they haven't done just about the best job. And they have very different strategies in a way. South Korea tested early, fast, and furiously. Japan has not really had a testing strategy. South Korea was very aggressive about contact tracing through technology. Japan has not necessarily gone that route. But there seems to me to have been, and this is a concept that I'm working out, so I'm not sure that it's entirely accurate yet, but something like institutional memory that a country can have when it has coronavirus experiences that is akin to the immunological memory that an individual body can develop after experiences the coronavirus. So a country like South Korea is not confronting coronavirus in 2019 for the first time. They dealt with MERS, a Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. They dealt with SARS-1 in 2003. They dealt with H1N1, which was technically a global pandemic. And so both the public and the government had certain policies in place, both in terms of familiarity with mask wearing and social distancing, and laws in place. They expedited the development of really, really fast and effective tests so that they could test 200,000 people in South Korea before the US, which has 6 times the population, had tested 20,000. So the reason that I think I'm drawn to South Korea for my answer here is that they are a picture of what the US can be emerging from this experience. They suffered from MERS. Their political leaders were punished for their failure to deal with the MERS virus in 2012. But as a result of that failure, they learned how to do better this time. And I think in large part they have. So it's my hope that we similarly develop that kind of institutional memory, both in the part of citizens who now know how to mask and social distance, and in the part of governments who hopefully will write new laws to expedite mass testing, enforce mask mandates really, really quickly. And also, I think this is a separate issue, but expedite the development of vaccines, probably through a surveillance of coronaviruses and influenza viruses around the world, so that when one of these things comes online, we can design an mRNA or siRNA or some other viral vector vaccine in order to confront that, and have a vaccine for people, not in 11 months, which was already a record, but 3 or 4 months.
That dovetails really nicely with my last question for each of you. And I was hoping that you could sort of take us through the kind of biggest thing that you've learned over your year covering the pandemic. And hopefully something surprising, not just, like, oh, I learned once again that, we should listen to science. But like something that you really, upended your initial assumptions when this thing was first breaking out.
I think one thing I did not expect us to get repeatedly tripped up over is just simply the semantic definitions of words and how much that impeded our pandemic response. So for example, in the beginning, I think there was a lot of conversation about is this virus actually being transmitted asymptomatically? And there was a lot of quibbling over is it asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic? And then there was a similar conversation over is it airborne? Are we using the word airborne the right way? And I just can't believe the fact that we were unable to communicate. We literally did not have the words, or people had different definitions of the words, was like so impeded the fact that yes, this virus does spread asymptomatically and it's airborne. And that really informs how we should have stopped it. But that stopped us from doing that for so long because we just didn't have the language for it.
Katie, what about you?
Yeah, it's a tough question. And I think one thing that has taken up a lot of brain space for me this past year is how science has collided so much with human behavior and the ways in which I think humans are not always compelled to follow the data exactly, because we're humans and we have emotions and we have our own like goals and needs and desires. And it's not just about data. I think watching a lot of discussions unfold over Twitter and in the media and just in like one-on-one conversations with people, it's been a really powerful reminder of how dangerous it can be to say, well, here's the evidence, end of story. I'm just going to flood you with information, and that's going to be the thing that changes your behavior, the thing that compels you to move over to my side of this argument. Nothing is ever that simple. I think we saw that with some of the bungled things in testing. It can be really confusing to think about what the most effective testing strategy is going to be for a ton of people when, they're being asked to interpret confusing results and they're not being given access to some of the most important tests that they need, like what they will do when given incomplete information or too much information. It's really interesting to watch that unfold with vaccines and seeing numbers be misinterpreted. And I think the really interesting patterns of like consumer behavior around which brand of vaccine am I getting? These are all like really understandable questions, but I think the best way to go about this is, and this kind of gets back to what Sarah said, is to really choose our language carefully. It's not just like the science that matters, but how we present the science that matters and how it's going to impact people. And I think really importantly, make them not feel like they're being talked down to, that we're trusting them with the information and presenting it in the right way.
I think those are great answers. And yeah, I guess picking up off that last point from Katie, I think one of the more important lessons that I've taken away from this experience is like how hard it is and how important it is to be epistemically flexible. You just have to be prepared to change your mind when the entire world is learning about an unprecedented global phenomenon at the same time. So in the first few weeks, right after, I guess, you, Ross, and I, cheers to old fashions in DC, and I was in total lockdown, I was like dunking my vegetables and fruits in soap water to the point that I was like probably poisoning myself with antiseptics. It just seemed very obvious that it's germ theory, it's science. Like germs are things you touch, and people were saying, don't touch your face and don't itch your eyes. And so like that, it implies that this is a disease that's spreading from surfaces. And then, the more information was coming out, it just became clear that like, okay, surfaces might play a small role, but it seems more like this is about large droplets and so-called spray aerosolized droplets. And then more and more information came out, and it's like, no, actually, this really seems like it is disproportionately an aerosolized virus, and that it's spreading through these tiny, tiny particles that waft around in the air and then bind to our ACE2 receptors. And so that's why I wrote this piece, Hygiene Theater, that we were continuing to have an early March approach to the virus, even in mid-July, when it was pretty clear, it seemed to a lot of epidemiologists, that this was mostly an aerosolized, not a fomite or surface touch virus. And it's not like, oh, I was so smart figuring that out. I wasn't smart figuring it out at all. I didn't figure it out. Someone figured it out for me. And I, as a journalist, was at the time didn't have so strong an ideology about how this virus spread that I was open to receiving the new evidence. And it's so hard, especially in subjects that you become not an expert in, but more knowledgeable in, to like maintain that epistemic flexibility, to maintain the idea that like you might be really wrong about something that's really important. And so that, I guess, is why I write a different thesis about the future of cities every single 6 weeks, is to always be covering my tracks. Yeah, I think it's just important to be able to be super flexible.
That is a great Atlantic-y note to end on. Sarah, Derek, and Katie, thank you for this conversation. That was great. And thanks to all of you who are watching, and most of all for subscribing. And we hope to see you at another virtual event soon.
Thank you.